Okay, welcome. Things have been really hectic lately. Um, I'm actually using a different program right now. I've had a lot of technical difficulties with Teams and other things, PowerPoint as well. This is going to be a little bit rougher than normal, I think. I hope not. I am using a different program, and I'm just kind of getting used to it. So let's move on. So the last thing we're talking about, of course, the 60s, big picture. But more specifically, I ended with talking a little bit about the Black Power movement, the rise of young Black men and women hitting the streets. By 1965, younger Black people are disenchanted. They're fed up with the threats that their people get. They're fed up with the beatings and the killings and the bombings. They're really fed up with all of the resistance to the acceptance and the recognition of Black humanity, of Black citizenship. You got to remember, these young people had for a long time looked on for years as MLK tried his nonviolent stuff. The boycotts, the sit-ins, the bus riding, the begging to be accepted. And as they watched, they fumed. They realized this stuff really is not working. The harder we push, the harder we get pushed back. We're going to see that sometimes they're going to start fighting back. And this really does start in the very early 60s. And it happens, as I mentioned, I think before, in northern cities, in western cities. This kind of thing isn't going to be as likely to happen in the South because of the differences in the South, differences north and south with regard to the existence and the status of Black folk. These young people are going to become the basis for the radical movement. Sometimes they're going to seek complete disengagement from white community. They're going to say, hey, you don't want us, I don't want you. You have to understand, a lot of these young people had tried to work with MLK's approach, but a lot of them are going to end up abandoning it. A prime example of this is the Cambridge movement. It's really the Cambridge Nonviolent Action Committee, but let's call it the Cambridge movement. Some people just call it CNAC. But anyway, this Cambridge movement starts in 1962. It begins as a non-violent sort of movement in the city of Cambridge, Maryland. It's founded by a woman named Gloria Richardson, who eventually is dubbed Glorious Gloria. And this group wants to fight in the early this is before 1963 and 64, all that violence that we saw, right? And so early on, they're talking about desegregating the public schools because that wasn't really happening despite Brown v. Board. They want to fight police brutality. They want job training for their people. They want an end to the unjust incarcerations and, as I mentioned, the police brutality. As this group is forming, eventually they're going to meet resistance because that's just what happens at this time. White folks start pushing back with threats, violence, the usual thing. In 1963, Gloria Richardson and the young people around her, they defend themselves. Despite what the NAACP had been saying, despite what CORE had been saying, they defend themselves. They're tired of all of this stuff, and they start burning white businesses. They shoot like 10 white men. Guess what? They're carrying guns now. When the National Guard is finally called in, Bobby Kennedy will eventually step in and try to calm things down. Bobby, of course, JFK's brother. He's going to step in and broker a deal with these leaders like Glorious Gloria, right? Now, you have to remember, this is, early 1963. All of this is very embarrassing to JFK. Remember, he was not a great civil rights icon in my eyes. So he sends his brother. And they hammer out what they start calling a, quote, treaty, this deal, in which the city is going to promise, look, we're going to try to give you improved public housing for Black folk. We're going to try to do this, right? More public housing and more housing options for Black folk. We're also going to try to work to desegregate the schools. Again, Brown v. Board of Education said they're supposed to, but they really hadn't. And they're going to work to desegregate public facilities, places of public accommodation. Keep in mind, this is before 1964, the 1964 Civil Rights Act. And so you have a city talking about doing this. Now, eventually, as time goes on, the city's not doing what it said it was going to do, go figure, right? Sit back and wait approach. The city begins actually backing down from some of these promises it had made, especially the call to integrate public accommodations. And it says, we can't really do this. We need to call for a vote on whether or not segregation in public accommodations should be ended. Again, this is before the 64 Act. So they're handling this at the local level. Well, in response to this, think about this. Richardson, she's like, look, no, we're not going to vote. She tells all her followers, do not vote, because what you're doing is buying into the system. Do not beg for your freedom. If you vote, you are allowing them to presume that they can call you a second-class citizen. Yeah, you're going to be allowed to vote, but they're going to, they might just, what they're saying is, it is our choice. She's saying, white people are trying to make this decision for us. How can this be voted on, she says. She says, white people have no power to give you what should be yours already, human rights. Now, a lot of white businessmen in the city will rally the white base because a lot of white businessmen don't want to deal with black folk. They're afraid of losing white patrons, for sure, if they have to do this. And they're afraid of a lot of things, right? They're also, of course, themselves very racist, a lot of them. I would say probably most of them, although, there's always people who don't feel that way. So these white businessmen come together and they rally the white base voters, and the white community will come out in droves. They're going to vote this down. This is not a surprise. They don't want racial mixing. Eventually, of course, we know the 1964 Civil Rights Act will address that later, but still here, they do not, the black folk don't win, but they're pushing for this already early on. And here's the rub. Here's what I want to get at, and that is this, that when this doesn't work, they're like, well, what the hell? This just doesn't work ever. So they're going to actually engage in new tactics. They're not going to allow people in power to dictate the terms to them. They're not going to accept crumbs. They're not going to beg. They're going to demand. So what do? They turn to violence. Of course, it's interesting because this was, the nonviolent committee, right? We had called it that. Cambridge Nonviolent Action Committee. Well, they started as a nonviolent group, but they didn't get their way, and so they're saying this MLK stuff isn't getting it. They turn to violence, and it's not going to be indiscriminate violence. They're not going to go be beating people up. They're talking about self-defense. Now, of course, sometimes this does devolve into rioting, especially when shortly after this whole vote was taken, these same white businessmen who had called on people to vote this down, they actually invite George Wallace to speak there in their town. Remember George Wallace? Segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. Another example, and this is again an early example of the Black Power movement in a sense, and the self-defense movement comes, another example is RAM, the Revolutionary Action Movement. This is a student group. It's a student group formed in Ohio at a historically black college, HBCU, right? Historically black colleges, universities. It formed in 1962 at Central State University. And this group is anti-colonialist. And what does it mean? What does that mean? They say we are a colonized people within our own country, and actually see themselves as a colonized people like other dark-skinned people around the world are being colonized. Not only do they see themselves as a nation within a nation, a black nation within a larger nation, but they see themselves as a nation worldwide. So they're tying their cause here to anti-colonialism in other areas. For example, Vietnam. So they're anti-colonial, they're anti-police, They see the police as vestiges of the slave patrols of old, like the remnants, right? Like they say these police are basically like the slave patrols of old, who all they were doing is being sent out to keep black people in check. Now, we we have to be careful with these ties. Of course, police are in fact doing a lot more, but from the perspective of these black folk, when it comes to them, that's how they see it. And I don't know that we can really blame them given the state of affairs in the early 60s. They see police as the military arm of the segregation movement, people who want to keep people apart. They see the police as the force that is used to maintain white power. Because in fact, anytime there's a dispute between a black person and a white person, all the white person has to do is call the police and point to the black person, and that's it. So you have to wonder how much that's actually changed, right? Because in the last years, we've seen all these incidents, a lot of incidents in the news where black people have had the police called on them for doing nothing other than, bird watching in New York City Park, or sleeping in a communal dorm area at Yale University, right? I'm on this site called nextdoor.com. You might have heard of it. I think it's nationwide, but it's in my neighborhood, right? We often hear, suspicious person walking down the street and yada yada, and they describe them. Of course, they don't want to say that person's black, but they kind of get to that. And it's just like, well, what's this person really doing? A lot of times they're not doing anything but walking through. Often they'll call the cops. And I'll tell you, I know the cops get really tired of that kind of thing today. Back in the day, they were all about it. Not to say that some of them today are not, but I think things are a lot different today when it comes to police matters and what they're trying to do in the community. They're dealing with a reality born out of all this time in the 60s, though, and all the past, right? Whenever there's a white cop encountering a black motorist, right there at that moment, it's not just them that's meeting in a sort of tense moment, but they're bringing with them all of this history. We have to understand that on both sides. And it's not the fault of either one of them, but they both carry it and they both have to deal with it. But anyway, so these people, the Cambridge students, right, they're calling for revolution. They are anti-police and anti-colonial, and they want black independence, and they want an improvement in schools, and they want businesses to allow them in. They want student organizations on all college campuses that are geared toward black studies or black student groups. And you're going to get a lot of that later on. Those kinds of groups at black colleges are normal. Black colleges, universities, law schools, everything. So they're calling for revolution. They're calling for black independence. And you see that a lot of these young people are, again, they're not the only one, this group. A lot of these young people are calling for this, and they're joining gun clubs. And they start to actually arm themselves for self-defense. So this starts early in the 60s. I should have said that was RAM. I said Cambridge, but that was RAM what we're talking about. Sorry. So we talked about Cambridge. We talked about RAM and how RAM is anti-colonialist, anti-police, and calling for revolution, right? Of course, we have other more notable figures that you've probably heard of, namely Malcolm X. He's a huge proponent of the sense of this emerging sense of black nationalism. We've seen black nationalism already. We've seen it in the 1920s with Marcus Garvey, right? And so that's still there. And he embraces this idea of being a nation within a nation. And he says people of color, and he's of course talking about black people, but he speaks generally too. He says people of color must fight. They must fight oppression everywhere. You cannot ask somebody to recognize your humanity. You must demand it. He's saying, no, civil rights, that's crap. We want human rights. So he's got this image, this idea of what his goal is, and it's not something you should, it's something you should demand. It's something that you should get. It's something you should not ask for. And we're talking about the very fact, the very nature of being human. He, among others, are pushing this whole black is beautiful thing. Black is beautiful. Black is beautiful because for a very long time, right? And this is just changing in the recent years. You know, for a very long time, black was thought to be ugly. You know, we didn't get a Miss America contestant winning Miss America until like what was it, the 80s, Vanessa Williams, and she's very light skinned. For until recently, the big female butt was considered obscene. It was considered too much. It was considered way too much. Now that's in. Now, of course, we have to be careful dealing with stereotypes, but I think we all understand what it is we're talking about here. Black hair, being, kinky curly, as some people would call it, black skin, and some eyes being too dark. But they're turning all that around, and they're saying, no, black is beautiful. And they're especially talking about their women. And these women who had forever been judged by white standards of beauty. Remember, everybody trying to straighten their hair and lighten their skin and so forth. These people, along with Malcolm X, but he's going to be a huge proponent of all this. They start to use the word black. He's a huge proponent of the word black. He says not Negro anymore. That's the old days. That word Negro is associated with slavery, associated with weakness. It is them calling you something. You accept the term Negro only because that's what they've always called you for the very long time. Ever since they just started calling you the N-word from from whenever, right? It's changed to Negro. But he says, we don't need to accept the term that's given to us. We're black, he says. So really, he is counterpoising. He's pushing back against everything that is associated with white superiority, right? Everything that's associated with white beauty and white purity. So he's got this powerful message that is going to be embraced by many people. And of course, he also embraces it because others have said these things to him as well. But he is, of course, a focal point. Malcolm X is, vilified, made into a villain by a lot of people, but he's largely misunderstood. And of course, he scares a lot of people because he rejects nonviolence. He's like, no. The tactic designed to integrate when you're nonviolent and you let people beat you up, that does not work, and you shouldn't have to suffer that. He says, black leaders like MLK are like working like the old black people working for the slave owners, doing the white man's bidding, he would say, keeping black people in their place, keep using black people to keep black people peaceful. He says, and you cannot love your oppressor. You cannot ask your oppressor to give up power. Why would he give up power? So he says, look, only revolution can change things. And he talks about by any means necessary. Any means necessary, those famous words, right? Now, his whole worldview is interesting. I read the autobiography of Malcolm X when I was a young man, long time ago. I guess I'm still young. Sorry, but I was really young. I was in college, and it changed my life, and it changed how I viewed certain things. And I grew up in the 80s when there was still a lot of open racism. People weren't going to get all crazy just because he said something weird on Twitter that people were like, oh my God, I can't believe he said that. No, none of that. You walk on the street, somebody's going to call you a name, and that's just the way it goes. You end up fighting, whatever, but you're not like, oh my goodness, you're not taken aback by it. You're not surprised by it. Anyway, he grows up, I grew up in this era, and so how did I get on that point? I already forgot where was I going? I was talking about how he said, by any means necessary, and I started talking about how his views were shaped by different things. And I went into my Cleveland story for whatever reason. I don't remember why. It doesn't matter. A little off today. Okay, so I think I was talking about the autobiography of Malcolm X, right? And how it changed my life, and how I always see, and there's lots of racial tensions, right? And because I lived on the edge and of a largely white sort of working class to poor neighborhood, I associated mostly with that side, although I had friends on the other side. But I was always kind of not necessarily caught in the middle. I want to put it like that. But I had opinions, you know what I mean? And this book changed my mind. I often had run-ins with young black men that didn't turn out well. So, when you grow up like this and you only see what's in front of you, you don't see the history. You don't see what's behind all of that until you learn more. And I read this book and it just blew my mind. So anyway, if you read this book, which I think everybody should, you'll see that this guy, Malcolm X, he really started as a criminal, as a hustler. Dealing drugs and working, gambling and doing weird things, and he goes to jail. He does a lot of jail time, and then he of course gets involved with the Muslim faith and becomes a member of the Nation of Islam, which is a Black American, African American, however you want to call it. These are black people in the United States who embrace Islam. And remember, there were a lot of Muslim slaves. There were a lot of people from Africa that were brought here as slaves who were Muslim. And so they're going back to that African heritage. And Malcolm X is going to be a very controversial speaker. He's going to be the most controversial and the most enigmatic speaker for the group, meaning people are going to, this guy has charisma. He will pack rooms. His message is going to be heard by countless young black folk. Eventually, he's going to fall out with the leadership, with the Nation of Islam. He's going to become apparently too powerful within the movement. He's going to become the face of it, and people will, of course, be a little bit jealous. At least this is the story that happens, right? This is how the story goes. And he eventually, when JFK is assassinated, he makes a comment to the public when he says, well, that's just the chickens coming home to roost. And that's just a way of saying, well, I mean, what do you want me to say? You want me to feel sorry for this man? You look at all this violence around us. This was bound to happen. And he's going to be silenced because of that. The Nation of Islam will use that as an excuse, if you will, or a reason, if you will, to silence him and then push him out. And he does. He eventually goes away. He goes off on his own. He travels to Mecca. When he goes to Mecca, of course, is the heart of Islam, the spiritual land and all that. He goes there and he will eventually soften his approach. He no longer say that white people and black people can never get along, because that's what he was saying for a long time. And he's always saying black people must do this on their own. Not only should white people and black people be separate, but white folk shouldn't even try to help us, because you can't help us. We have to help ourselves. But when he goes to Mecca, he sees black and brown and white people, all Muslims, acting, and living and being in peace and spirituality with each other. So after this trip, he kind of changes his tact and he looks to create ties with white sympathizers. Meanwhile, interestingly enough, toward, later on in the final years of MLK's life, when he dies in 1968, in the final years of his life, he starts becoming a little more radical, if you will. So even though these guys seem like polar opposites, to the end, toward the end of the life of each, they start kind of gravitating toward each other. So anyway, he sets up an organization because he wants to address black issues, and he wants to work with white folk, and he wants to do it through politics. And he says it doesn't have to necessarily be violent. So he really changes. But again, he's going to, I think I mentioned this, he's going to be assassinated. In 1965 in New York City, when he's giving a speech on stage, he's going to be fired upon. If you don't read the book, at least watch the movie. It is long, 3+ hours or something like that, 4 hours maybe. It's called X, I think, right? Spike Lee film came out right around early 1990s. It's got what's his name, Denzel Washington. Quite a good movie. The book, of course, is going to be better. So when he's assassinated by the Nation of Islam, a lot of speculation arises about whether or not the members of the Nation of Islam had help from the federal government, because he and MLK Jr. were always under surveillance, and Malcolm was always seen as more of a threat. His message of resistance had already taken hold. So even though he seems to be backing away from this, his message is out there, and the government still doesn't trust him. So there seems to, and this has not been proven, but there's a lot of speculation and a lot of, let's say, evidence, if not proof, that maybe these people had help from the federal government in his assassination. We got to be careful with these things because we don't know. So all of these examples that I've talked about, right? We're talking about the Cambridge group, the RAM, Malcolm X. All of these groups are in fact representative of something, right? They represent the rising sense of Black nationalism, of Black separatism, right? Start talking about, you know, being separate. Black is beautiful. We're talking about the Black Power movement, and all of this that I've talked about is before 1965. And by 1965, and by, you know, all that stuff before 1965, you know, with all the lunch counter sit-ins and all of the freedom rides, and of course the horrors of 63 and the horrors of 64. By 1965, young people have seen all of this, and they're more radical, and they say this, you know, that stuff just doesn't work. And let's maybe turn to these other examples: the Cambridge example, the RAM example, the Malcolm X example. They start saying, quote, "If we can't sit at your table, we'll knock the fucking legs off," is what he says. Well, I think it was Stokely Carmichael. It might not have been him. But anyway, one of these young radicals says that. If we can't sit at your table, we'll knock off the legs. And that sentiment is soon going to spread. And that sentiment in 1966 will get a shot in the arm, so to speak. It's spurred by yet another shooting. James Meredith, you might remember, had embarked on what he called a march against fear, a march against fear campaign, where he's going to be walking from city to city, state to state. And his hope, of course, is to bring attention with this one-man march. And I think it was like from Memphis, Tennessee to Jackson, Mississippi, right? So he's going to walk a long way. Bring attention to this. Well, what happens? He's shot. He's shot in the legs. He's shot in the neck. He's shot in the back. And he's shot by an avowed white supremacist. When this happens, MLK starts pushing for marches for laws, or starts asking Congress to pass laws to protect civil rights workers. Because, I mean, how else can you make change if you're afraid to walk down the street talking about civil rights? So MLK, he goes on marches, and he talks to Congress, and he's saying, well, look, we need to protect civil rights workers when they're out there. Younger people go on their own marches, and they are under the banner of resistance. They're calling for self-defense after this. In fact, in the wake of this shooting, a guy named Stokely Carmichael is going to be a major leader of SNCC. Remember that. Stokely Carmichael delivers a speech. He says, look, I've been arrested dozens of times, and he's like, I'm not going to jail anymore. And he says, the only way to stop, quote, white men from whipping us is to take over. And then he raises his fist to the sky, and he proclaims Black Power. And he starts talking about an embrace of Africa, an embrace of African culture and history. So you're seeing many different movements kind of cropping up at this time. Part of what Carmichael wants is this embrace of Black culture, African culture specifically, and history. And so we're going to see people start gravitating to this new philosophy. Inspired by Stokely Carmichael, a lot of young Black people are going to embrace what becomes known as kawaida. Kawaida is translated, I think it's from the Swahili, but they're going to be translating this. Translated, it means total way of life. So kawaida means taking the African culture as a total way of life. You take an African name, you learn an African language, like Swahili. You wear African garb, right? Clothing, these thing called daishikis and all that. So you're going to be speaking the language, wearing the garb, taking the name, and engaging in African rituals. And in fact, because they're African American, right? Meaning they're in both worlds, they actually invent a holiday. Well, all holidays are invented. This one was invented later than a lot of others. This is Kwanzaa, right? And it is around the Christmas holiday. But what they're trying to do is embrace African tradition. And in fact, this also means familial traditions where Black people are supposed to respect their elders, where Black people are supposed to cooperate with each other. They're supposed to love each other and themselves. And they say the reason that Black folk, the people who believe in Kawaii and all that, Carmichael is one of them, they say, look, the problems in the Black community are associated with the fact that Black people in the United States are disconnected from Africa. They're disconnected from African history and African culture. If we just get back to that, we'll be okay. But that's like saying, you can ignore all the structural problems around you, all of the racism and the history of discrimination around you. You ignore all that, you just have this back to Africa, and it's not back to Africa meaning go physically, but back to African culture. If you have this back to Africa movement, it's not going to be enough. People will say, a lot of other young people will reject this approach. They're going to say the problem is not Black folk. The problem is the structures that have been erected by white folk. The poor education, the housing, the healthcare, the voting, discrimination. And we all not only are discriminated in these areas, but that results in our receiving lower level sorts of education, lower level healthcare, lower level housing. It means that we can't even vote for people that will support our way of life or support our interests. So these people start coming out, rising up and shaking their fists and saying, no, the problem's not us. The problem is, in fact, the system. An example of this are two men named Huey P. Newton and Bobby Seale. In Oakland, California, they had already advocated for students in California colleges. These guys had come together and they had won, for example, the creation of Black studies and Black history programs at local colleges, and they had won the fact that these credits, if can actually be transferred to other universities, and this is hard to do, to get colleges to sort of accept this and to get the state universities to accept this. So Huey P. Newton and Bobby Seale have already advocated for that and have gotten some they've made some headway advocating for students. These people are going to reject the ideas of Africanism and African history, and they're going to favor a new brand of Black pride. You want pride, but we're Black Americans, they say. We want inclusion here. We want our way of life accepted, and so you can have the Back to Africa movement in terms of culture, but you cannot ignore the problems that surround us. You're basically dropping out of society and kind of creating your own little society. That's okay, but we need inclusion here, and we can do that through Black solidarity. Everybody, all the Black folk coming together, and Black self-defense. Eventually, of course, they form a new group, and it's called the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense. A lot of people, probably yourself, have heard of the Black Panther Party, but most people don't know that it was actually entitled the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense. These people see themselves as defending not just their rights, but their person, their bodies, their people. and they're defend themselves in various ways. It's not just, as we'll talk about in a moment, with guns. Their goal is to reform or break down all the structures that are erected by white folk that have kept these people down, right? So they want to reform or break down the educational structures, the housing structures, the healthcare, the voting, all that stuff that we talked about. They say we need to do that. But of course, they're remembered specifically for their push against police. So when they talk self-defense, they're saying we need to fight in self-defense for education, housing, healthcare, and voting, but that we also need to fight for personal self-defense. We need to push back against police harassment and police brutality. And so they're anti-police. And what they start to do in Oakland and the surrounding areas in San Francisco and so forth is they start to follow police around as the police are patrolling in their neighborhoods. They follow them around. They take notes. They try to take pictures and stuff. And of course, cops, nobody likes to be, have somebody look over their shoulder when they're working, especially cops. Now, it is legal to do that. And the reason they know is that who was it? Bobby Seale or Hugh Newton? I want to say it was Bobby Seale, who was a law student at this time. It's slipping my mind for now. But anyway, they know that this is legal. As long as you stay away a certain number of feet from the cops, you can watch them work. But not only do they follow the cops around, they're carrying weapons openly. What's interesting is that the Black Panther Party is going to be the first modern day organization to be so open and so vocal and so loud about the Second Amendment. Again, one of these guys, Seale, I think, is a law student. So he argues that the Second Amendment gives them a right to bear arms. They say this is part of our self-defense. And in fact, they are arguing this in 1967 and carrying weapons around, scaring the hell out of white folk, scaring the hell out of black people too. The older guard, right? The older folk, the church folk, and all these people. They're scaring them too, carrying weapons around, talking about kill Whitey, because they get to that point as well. Of course, and California people see all of this, they get scared and they start pushing through, because by the way, this was legal in California to carry guns like that. California pushes to change its laws because of these guys. And on the day that legislators are voting on this anti-gun bill in 1967, the Black Panthers march onto the Capitol steps fully armed, and you're talking about rifles and so forth, and they walk into the Capitol building fully armed, and there's no law against it. They're peaceful. They're polite. They're civil. They say it's their right. What's interesting is that the bill that was about to be passed, and it does pass, was called for and eventually signed by Governor Ronald Reagan, who later on is going to be a big gun rights guy. This bill was called for by police. It was called for by Ronald Reagan. It was called for by white folk who fear black men walking around with guns. What's interesting is that the NRA, the National Riflemen's Association, I guess, they're pretty quiet on this. In fact, the NRA by the 60s is still okay with laws that limit gun rights. They were fine with it. The NRA is not really a Second Amendment organization until the 1970s. Before that, remember, the NRA was actually formed right after the Civil War, and it was formed as a sportsman and a shooting kind of organization. The idea was that men should know how to shoot in order to defend the country. And it was an organization like that. They didn't care about the Second Amendment. It wasn't until the 1970s, out of a fear that laws are disarming, because what happens when black people are walking around with guns, California begins to outlaw it, other states begin to outlaw it, and then you start seeing the federal government get involved more than before, and the NRA and a lot of white folk who fear that they're going to be disarmed, they take over the NRA. They fear of being disarmed, and of course they're seeing all of this turmoil in the streets, and we're going to get to all the turmoil in a moment. There's a lot of rioting in the 60s. We've already touched on that, but we're going to talk about it some more. The point is that white men are seeing this, the NRA is seeing this, and they actually in the 1970s finally make the Second Amendment the heart of their organization. And they actually changed the sign on the headquarters to the words of the Second Amendment. Of course, not the entire Second Amendment. They don't talk about militia. They don't say a well-regulated militia being necessary for the security of a free state. They just say the right to bear arms should not be infringed. So if you are a gun person, then you should probably, and you believe in the Second Amendment, then maybe you should thank the Black Panthers, because it was because of them and other groups like them. Mexican people were doing this. They were called Brown Berets. The American Indian movement was doing this. I don't have time to go into all of that. The point is, brown people were walking around carrying, brown and black people and red people, I guess, were going around carrying guns, and the country was like, oh crap. So they start passing laws to stop it, and then other people push back. Anyway, they're not all about this. They're also about, that is the Black Panthers, also, they're not just about, anti-police and all that. They're also pro-community, very pro-community. They actually push for employment and education and healthcare. That's their whole thing. And they themselves walk the walk as well as talk the talk, because they organize amongst themselves. I'm going to have to pause this for just one moment. Just give me a quick second. I apologize. I would hum for you, but my voice isn't that nice. Play some background music for you. Come on. Okay. All right. Okay. All right. So they talk the talk and they walk the walk. They actually organize free lunch campaigns for kids in their neighborhood. And they invite anybody. They're not just inviting black people. They invite anybody who's hungry. And so they set out these, these big tables, and they, got these big pots and all kinds of, you can imagine like a huge picnic outdoors, right? Or sometimes inside, sort of recreation centers or, churches or whatever. So they set out free lunches. They set out to help people with healthcare, free medical exams, blood pressure, things like this, whatever they can do. They're pro-community. And in fact, they form alliances with other anti-poverty groups, including white groups. So they're about reaching out to the other side. But they do reject peaceful protest. They do, reject this idea that it's the African culture's fault. Notice something. The Black rights movement is not monolithic, meaning it's not all the same. Right? There are major divisions. Well, actually, there are several divisions, and one of the most obvious division we've seen so far when it comes to the Black rights movement is a difference between the nonviolent group and the self-defense group. The nonviolent group, the old guard, people like MLK Jr., that's going to be different from the younger group, the new guard, the self-defense group, who are younger, more radical, talking about black nationalism, black power, black is beautiful, walking around wearing a big old afro. no longer call themselves Negro, but calling themselves instead Black or African American, Afro American. And a lot of these young people are talking about separatism, meaning separate out from the white community. If you don't want us, we don't want you, right? So that's the major difference, right, between the nonviolent group and the self-defense group. But even within the youth division, even within, the youth sort of community, the youth movement of activists, there will be a split. On the one hand, you're going to have the naturalists. These are the people who believe in this whole idea of going back to your African culture, your African roots. They're the ones who are embracing kawaii and everything that comes with it, with the language and the clothing and all of that. That they say we can uplift our community by embracing this African culture. Those are the naturalists. The Black Panther, though, party is all about, they're called the structuralists, and they're all about how Black people cannot be saved by merely embracing Africa or merely separating out. We must identify and we must dismantle all of the discriminatory structures of racism and discrimination. These Black Panthers, who are the structuralists, will say that these other people, these other Black power groups, right? Black power groups, and they are Black power groups, but see Black power coming in different forms, right? The Black Panthers see it their way, the structuralists, and the naturalists, they see it another way. That's Stokely Carmichael, that gang, who talk about Black power, but Black power in their own way. The Black Panthers will call people like Stokely Carmichael and those people who are, and even other Black power groups, they'll say, you're nothing but some armchair revolutionaries, meaning, right, you just sit there, on the couch and you talk about revolution, you don't do anything. Sit there on the couch with your arms up on the armchair. They also call them Oreos. You might have heard this term before. It's a person who's black on the outside and white on the inside. So you use that against people. They call people Uncle Toms. You might remember from Uncle Tom's Cabinet. It's something that we talked about, right? Uncle Tom was a slave who was beaten, right? The book was written, of course, by Harriet Beecher Stowe, and it was written in response to the Fugitive Slave Act. You remember that? That seems like so long ago, right? Well, the Uncle Tom character in the book was someone who withstood a lot of pain and suffering. Now that term has been turned around. His name has been turned around to mean something else. You do not act like an Uncle Tom. You will not allow yourself to be whipped. That's the thinking. They call other Black power groups Oreos, Uncle Toms, and armchair revolutionaries. And of course, some of this stuff is also stuff that they call MLK, right? And of course, they'll say MLK is a sellout because of the whole, especially because of the whole nonviolence thing. Cops, they call them pigs. You might have heard cops be called pigs. That comes from the 60s. And they say a pig is this lowly beast. Notice they're making comparisons with police. A pig is a lowly beast. It is ravenous. It eats whatever you give it. It is depraved, meaning it only cares about itself. It is reactionary, meaning it doesn't think. It just reacts. So they use this word to call police. They use pigs to refer to police. This word will eventually be picked up by all sorts of young people during the 60s, white, black, and brown. Everybody's going to be referring to cops as pigs. Even in my neighborhood when we were growing up, right, which was not an all-black neighborhood, as I said, of course, that word was common. When we were referring, or when people were referring to cops. All these various movements that we're seeing, Black Power and so forth, right? All these various movements are going to reflect and foster a culture of resistance among ordinary Black folk. especially after 1965. So it's going to reflect the culture of resistance, but also, by example, will produce more resistance. And you have to understand that these movements are going to be rooted in the continuing history of abuse and discrimination. People have had it. So in the 60s, hundreds of cities are going to be rocked by violence. These acts of violence and these huge so-called riots are sometimes going to be called instead rebellions. Some observers will say they're riots. Other people say no, people are rebelling for their rights. This is a revolution. Riots are spontaneous. They come out of nowhere. Shouldn't you know that this is going to happen? You've been told all along by people like MLK Jr., who said, you got to give in because the people will fight. So there's lots of violence, whether you want to call it a riot or a rebellion. They usually refer to as riots. So whatever you think about that, know that it's more nuanced than all that, because people say it's a rebellion and a revolution, not necessarily a riot. But we have to understand violence stems from continuing problems. It also comes from the fact that the government is calling on black men to go off to fight in Vietnam. And I think I forgot this slide. Oh no, there it is. Vietnam. Just give you, the Vietnam War is going to be chewing up black bodies by the late 1960s. Just a little background, the United States has a long history of interference in Asia. In 1965, the United States finally puts real boots on the ground in Vietnam. It had, military there before, but in 1965 is a major turning point. Lots of boots on the ground in Vietnam. It's all part of the rollback policy during the Cold War. They're all part of the whole domino theory, right? The idea that if you let Vietnam fall to communism, then all the other nations in Asia will fall to communism. And Vietnam right now is, of course, rocked by revolution. The French in the 1960s, and for a long time, actually, for decades, had occupied Vietnam. And the Vietnamese leader, a guy named Ho Chi Minh, we don't need to go into all of this, just kind of background, right? Ho Chi Minh, of course, he actually calls on communism as a tactic. He becomes communist, sure, but initially he really is leading a nationalist struggle for freedom from the French. The Vietnamese had been occupied for over 1,000 years by the Chinese and other countries, and by the 1960s they pretty much had it. So they end up kicking out France. Actually, France finally gives up as an occupying power, and by this time, of course, the north of Vietnam seems like it's going to be going all communist, because even though it didn't start that way, communism became the vehicle to bring people together. Anyway, that's a very simple kind of way of putting it, but it's right, I think. So anyway, the United States in 1965 really has largely replaced France as an occupying power, and it's stoking a civil war between North and South Vietnam. We, of course, support South Vietnam. By the late 60s, we're fully invested in the civil war, pumping money into South Vietnam, bombing civilians in the North, drafting countless young men. By the late 60s, people are wondering why their boys are being sent off to fight such a war war with no clear goals, with no clear enemy, and their boys are coming home in body bags every day. Young black people are going to push back. You're going to have all these different groups, Black Panthers and all these different groups pushing back against the war. And they're, in fact, going to be sparking a lot of the initial movement against the war. And, of course, you're going to see a lot of white kids also jumping in this. But the white kids don't really jump in until later on, when white college students jump in, because they are going to start to be drafted after about 1968. For the first few years of the war, white kids could get out of fighting if they were in college. Well, anybody could get out. Let me rephrase. Anybody could get out of being drafted if they're in college. But history being what it is, as we know, there were very few black men in college. Therefore, a lot of black men are available for this pool of soldiers. And so they're going to be drafted in large numbers. A lot of middle class people who tended to be white also have maybe connections with doctors who can write them a note, right? Be like Trump and have your doctor write that you have bone spurs and therefore can't go to Vietnam. Most black kids at this time cannot do that. By far, most of them cannot. So you have the college deferment, right? For white folk, that doesn't really help. For white men, that doesn't really help black men. You have, excuse me, the connections to doctors that could help them. Also, even when they are drafted or when they volunteer, which doesn't happen a whole lot volunteer-wise, a lot of people don't want to go. When they are drafted or volunteer and they take tests, they test at lower levels because of the history of discrimination in education, and therefore are not going to be given the best jobs in the military. They're going to have a gun stuck in their hand and put on the front line. Now, of course, we should recognize that Vietnam, just like a lot of wars, is a working class war. This war is going to be fought by the lower classes. It's going to be in raw numbers, mostly white men, because they are the vast majority. However, black men will be, in fact, drafted, Mexican American men too, by the way, drafted in much larger numbers than in their proportion of the population. So they're going to be drafted in higher numbers than they actually exist within the larger population. So, for example, at this point, I think it was 12%. They made up like 11 or 12% of the population, but they were being drafted at about a rate of 13+%. So a little bit more, but in raw numbers, that's a lot of money. That's a lot of people, right? And so they can't. The point is, a lot of these young men are going to be put on the front lines, and then they're going to be sent to do the most dangerous work. There's a lot of racial problems at this time. In fact, because black men are being, and all men, of course, we know that, but black men are being sent to the front line by white officers, even though all this history is laying on both of their backs, and there's going to be all kinds of problems. There's going to be lots of what they call fragging, where they sometimes they will throw a pineapple at their own leader, at their own unit commander. Pineapple meaning a grenade, right? This happens. And interestingly enough, because of things like this is why later on, and I'm kind of getting ahead of myself here, but later on, the military is going to push for affirmative action to bring black men into officer positions, which is going to be a huge, huge change from what we saw in the earlier wars. Point being, by late 60s, there's a huge movement against Vietnam. Black folk are a huge part of that. MLK Jr. has come on board now against the war, but of course the young people were ahead of him. Muhammad Ali, famous boxer, big mouth, right? This guy is a different sort of character. I'm going to post, I think, a clip so you can kind of see for yourself. The guy, it's a kind of a rough clip, but it'll give you an idea. Muhammad Ali was bad, right? So he's the heavyweight champion of the world. He used to be called Cassius Clay, but he becomes a member of the Nation of Islam. When he does that, a lot of the people in the country, not just white people, but black people, turn their back on him. A lot of black Christians turn their back on him, right, as a traitor. But a lot of white people see him as a traitor also, because not only that, but he actually refuses to be inducted into the military. He will initially say it's a religious thing for him, but of course he's not going to win that argument, because Muslims do not abhor, do not reject all fighting. You can't pick and choose your battles. So they were right about that. But then he says, look, and it could be opportunistic, but then he starts saying, hey, I'm a black man, and these black people never did anything to me, right? He repeats something that Stokely Carmichael says about the Vietnam War. He says, no Viet Cong. The Viet Cong were, of course, the enemy of the U.S. in Vietnam. He says, no Viet Cong ever called me the N-word, right? And so what we have here is a huge push against Vietnam And Muhammad Ali is going to be at the center of that, and he, of course, is going to be somebody that is going to be hated by a lot of the country. But, I mean, I'm going to show you this clip, and so you can decide for yourself. And you'll see he is quite the talker. And in later years, unfortunately, he's going to kind of be losing his mind from all the beatings he's taken. I mean, not that he took a lot of beatings. This guy used to do this rope-a-dope thing where he just let people hit him, and he'd hide in the corner and come out and beat the hell out of him. He was someone who, before, what's that guy's name? He's this Irish fighter. I can't think of his name. He's an Irish fighter. I can't remember his name, but he would call the round in which he's going to take the guy down. But Muhammad Ali used to do that first, and he'd say, if you take you down in the third round, and if you make me angry, I will just punish you for a couple extra rounds, and then I'll call the round and then take you down. And then he would do it. I think he only missed maybe one. He would do this a lot. Point is, he's going to be vilified for all of this. So all of this is happening in the background, right? As we're seeing the rise of Black Power, we're seeing the rise of anti-Vietnam sentiment, right? And all of this is going to be in the background as the nation is going to explode in riots in the late 1960s. Because in the late 1960s, a lot of things are still problematic. Public accommodations, even though the 1964 Civil Rights Act actually prohibited discrimination in places of public accommodation, there's still a lot of, people don't change overnight, right? You saw with Brown v. Board of Education, people don't change overnight. The schools are still largely segregated. And in the late 1960s, there's still a lot of groups that will not allow Black people into their businesses. And you're going to see a lot of riots because of this. For example, in 1966, we have the Huff riots. Huff is this neighborhood. I actually grew up about a mile, not even a mile, just a few blocks away from it on Cleveland's east side. This neighborhood in the 60s and even today, very poor, very crowded, and pretty much all Black. For sure today, more so than in the 60s. But there was, in the 60s, there were still some pockets of white folk in the area. You're not going to find that today, I don't think. It's been a while since I've been there, but last time I was there was about 5 years ago. Anyway, the spark of these riots is where a white-owned bar in the city's east side, in the middle of this neighborhood, it's patronized by lots of Black folks. So a lot of Black folk go there, but it's white-owned. And at one point, the white bartender, I think it was the owner, actually denies a Black man a glass of water. And he apparently shoots him a racial epithet. He calls him the N-word or something like that. And he puts up a sign saying, "No water for N's," right? And in response to this, people are just like, oh, hell no, right? This is the 60s. Crowd gathers. They start throwing rocks. They start doing the smash and grab, right? So they start looting stores. They're vandalizing buildings and cars, or setting fires in buildings. They start engaging in sniper fire. So this is all blowing up. The government, of course, is going to respond. They're going to close, the city's going to close all the bars in the area. The National Guard will finally come in and shut it all down. When I grew up, we moved into that area in like 1978 and 79. And so I was young, but I still remember the feel that there's still a sense of aftermath, because, you drive or go through that neighborhood or go by it, you see empty lots. You see empty buildings. You see a lot of poverty and despair. That stuff was just, you could tell that something had happened there. I didn't know anything about it, right, until I grew up and learned more about it. In the end, though, 4 people are dead. Oh, by the way, when I grew up in Cleveland, all the stores had these cages on them, right, all through there. They don't really have that anymore because things have changed, but all the storefronts would have these massive cages on them. For for anti-rioting stuff. Anyway, in the end of the day, 4 people are dead. All of them are Black. 2 of them, in fact, were innocent bystanders. Others, the other two had been killed by white men. So one of them had been ruled self-defense. Point is, there are people dead. And it's like, what, all over a glass of water? Really, it's about the fact that they're not being served in public accommodations despite the 1964 Act, right? So there's all these tensions that are brought, as I said before, when a white cop comes up against a black driver, there's all this history and tension that is brought to bear there. Much like what happened here with this white bartender and this young black man who wanted a glass of water. All of that comes together. There's tensions, right? There's historical tension, and there's a lot of rising tension as well. Now, another example of this with regard to public accommodations happens in South Carolina. It's called the Orangeburg Massacre. Now, this happens right around South Carolina State University, which is an HBCU, right? Historically black college, right? Anyway, there is, in 1967, in the town where the school is, still a bowling alley that says whites only. It's still there, despite the Act of 64. So black students decide, we're going to target this. So 5 of them stage a sit-in, much like those 4 students in Greensboro in North Carolina years earlier, 6 years earlier, right? So they're going to stage a sit-in, and they're going to refuse to leave. And the next day, and they're peaceful. The next day, of course, they come back. A bunch of them come back, and 15 of them are arrested. Why are 15 of them arrested? Well, it's the usual thing. Things seem to have changed. In response to this, though, hundreds and hundreds of black students will descend on the bowling alley. And when they get there, they're going to be confronted by law enforcement. And law enforcement, to their credit, they try to calm down the crowd. They say, okay, we're going to free these 15 people that were arrested. Now, of course, these people shouldn't have been arrested in the first place. But they're, as things are kind of maybe calming down, there's still a little tensions, yelling back and forth. A fire truck arrives on the scene. And when that fire truck arrives, visions of fire hoses and all that stuff that we've seen, there's all of that alerts these students. They say, oh, hell, it's going to break loose. So the students panic, and they actually start to run and retreat, and they end up being pushed back into a window of the bowling alley, and several people crash through it. When this happens, the police just pounce on them. And they beat several women very badly, several black women. The students start running, they're breaking, and because of the violence by the police, they start breaking windows on their way out, they're vandalizing cars. And the police, of course, continue beating students. In the end, dozens of these kids are injured, and I will call them kids because they're a lot younger than I am. 3 black men are shot and killed by police, and all of them are either shot in the back or from the side, not in the front. What's interesting about this is going to be the first deadly confrontation between college students and police in the 60s. You might have heard of the Kent State Massacre in 1970, 4 students. Also Jackson State in 1970, protesting Vietnam War and so forth, and kids get killed. But this is going to be the first deadly confrontation between college students and police. Of course, it's not over the Vietnam War, but these are college students who are waking up. Now, the city is eventually going to listen to the students' complaints about continued discrimination and police brutality, but things aren't going to change anytime soon. You have to understand that police at the time are seen as, black people in particular, as soldiers for white superiority. And even a lot of white people at the time saw it this way. Let's look at, riots having to do with police action. The Watts riots, right? This was one of the most famous one. Again, some people would call it the Watts Rebellion. It sparked when a young black man is pulled over by a white cop. The young kid is suspected of DWI. The crowd gathers. It's an all-black neighborhood. Watts. It's poor. Long history of suffering of police abuse and discrimination. Tensions have been high for years. have seen the violence of the recent years, right? Medgar Evers, the killing of 4 young girls in Birmingham, the assassination of Malcolm X, all of that. Now, the stories vary. When this crowd is there, what happens is either this kid resists arrest or the cop uses excessive force to arrest him. Whatever. The point is, either story is plausible, believable. If he did resist, why did he resist? Given the history, again, when these two people come together, they're bringing to this engagement a lot of baggage. So if he resists, why? Of course, today people say, oh, the easiest thing to do is not resist. And I understand that. When I get stopped by cops, I'm all yes, sir, no, sir, because I've been in trouble with cops before for no damn reason. So I say yes, sir, no, sir. But you get tired of that. If it happens and happens and happens, and this is the 60s, all of a sudden you just might say, the hell with it. And you might just fight back and resist arrest because you know that what you were doing was not wrong. Or he was doing something wrong, and the cop did, in fact, use excessive force, which, of course, was common at the time. Either one of these could have happened. The point is, this is the 60s. And again, it's all part of the history coming to bear at one moment. So violence is going to break out, right? There's going to be looting. There's going to be destruction of property. And by the way, Watts is a neighborhood of Los Angeles. I don't know if I mentioned that, right? It's in California. So there's going to be looting, destruction of property, the burning of homes and businesses. And it's going to be like a whole week long of violence. And at the end, dozens of people are dead, again, mostly black. And there's tens of millions of dollars in damage. And of course, we have the Newark riots, where police arrest and beat on a black cab driver. Cab driver, not sure how the story goes, but gets arrested and beaten, and the crowd gathers, and it won't leave, and it gets really unruly, and the police force them out of the area. They use force. Because of this, mobs will roam the streets. They start looting, they start burning, they start attacking cops. Now, by the time the National Guard comes in to put this down, a few dozen people are dead. Again, mostly black. And there's about more than $10 million of damage. Detroit. So this keeps going. Again, this is all about police brutality, right? Police in Detroit, there were a bunch of illegal after-hours joints, meaning that they're serving alcohol too late, right? So police raid this illegal after-hours joint. It is a black establishment. It's illegal, but it's one of many. Often cops would target them specifically. Right? Even though other people might be doing something wrong, you target the people that you know are the usual suspects, I suppose, the people that you have something against. I'll give you an example. Somebody I know about 10 years ago became a police officer. It was just 10 years ago in Cleveland. And I remember he told me that in his first 6 months on the job, he was just like, he didn't like what he saw. I mean, he's still on the job. You can only do so much, right? But what happened was his boss told him to go down into the Flats. The Flats area is at the time, a huge entertainment sector. All kinds of different clubs and stuff like that down there. And in one little pocket of it, there is like a huge black club. Only black people go there. That's by and large. Others go there too, but it's a black club, you can imagine, right? And so a lot of people, parking is really bad in that area, and so people just kind of park, and it's like, what's the big deal? Because all the factories or whatever businesses are there that are not, that are not clubs, they're closed, and so people just start parking where it says no parking. Really, that should be enforced during the day. Sure, I get that, but they don't allow parking there at night. But everybody parks wherever the hell. Well, this guy I know says, that his boss, the guy that was training him, said, oh, let's go down there to that club and let's just ticket all the cars on that street. Now, they know whose cars these are because it's often a little pocket, right? Black people park there all the time to go to the black club. There aren't any people there, so you can't say, well, you're being targeted, right? If you're an owner of this car, you're parked illegally, strictly speaking. But we all know what's happening here. they're being targeted. So this stuff does happen. So in Detroit in 1967, the cops raid this illegal after-hours joint. Sure, it's illegal, but everybody's doing it, kind of thing. They arrest nearly 100 people. And the crowd, there's a huge crowd that gathers at the scene, and they start throwing bricks, and they start throwing rocks at cops. The cops, again, to their credit, they try to ignore it. But the violence grows. And the crowd turns to smash and grab, the usual thing, right? Looting, setting fires. And the crowd is going to outnumber the cops. So the governor has to, really, I mean, just people just all up in the streets. The governor has to set a curfew, calls out the National Guard. We're not dealing with police officers anymore. They're dealing with soldiers. And these National Guardsmen they're not police officers the way that they should be trained in policing with people. They shoot indiscriminately. They're not all that careful. And this makes matters worse because they start shooting and the riot will rage and eventually shut down the city. LBJ has to send in federal troops. The troops, these soldiers, will finally push back the rioters back into their neighborhood because it spilled out. The rioters from inside their neighborhood are going to set up snipers. They're going to set up on buildings and behind trash cans and everything and start shooting at cops, start shooting at military, start shooting at firemen who were just there to put out the fires. And of course, this is bad. I know that. My brother's a fireman, right? I would hate for this to happen to him when he's just trying to put out fires. So I get, people what they think when they see this, but we also have to understand the history of it. Point is, they start sniping and shooting and all that, and they lay siege to a police station. Start firing on a police station. Now, this actually happened, right? I think in Portland, Oregon, in 2020, after the shooting of Floyd. What was his name? Floyd. What was his name?
George Floyd.
George Floyd. Thank you. My son is right here. So George Floyd. So a lot of riots in 2020 in the summer, of course, and I think that at one point, check me on this, I'm not really sure, but I think that they actually, were firing on a police station. Anyway, this riot in Detroit finally dies out, and at the end, there's like 50 people dead. Too many of them are innocent bystanders. A lot of looters are dead. One cop is dead. One fireman is dead, and most of the people who are dead, of course, are black. Most of the 58 of them or so were white. Now, these are all just examples of cities burning from 1965 into the early 70s. Just examples of shootouts between police and armed black groups in the various cities, including Cleveland, where I grew up. Because of this, you're going to see a huge, huge spike in white flight. After the 60s, the cities will empty out of white folk. And I understand that. Nobody wants to be in all of this. A lot of middle-class white folk and middle-class black folk and older black folk don't want to be in this. A lot of them are church-going folk, and they're sort of molded in the MLK model. They don't want to deal with any of this. As the nation is burning, people across the country they're offering different opinions about the cause. Now, a lot of black leaders, I don't know why this is here. Put book quote here. Forget. Yeah, I was supposed to put a quote there, I suppose. Disregard that. A lot of black leaders will denounce the violence, but they will say, we understand it. The new leader of CORE, I can't remember his name, CORE, right? The group, right? Congress on Racial Equality. CORE had been a group that really did not want violence to be the way forward. But the new leader of CORE, when he sees all these cities burning, says this was only a matter of time. It was a matter of time before black people would fight back. The nation had already been told this. MLK had said this, right? History bears this out. Look back to the early slave rebellions. Even aboard ships, people will always try to break their chains, whether they are real chains around their ankles or they are abstract chains around their minds and their bodies. MLK Jr. agrees with this leader of CORE. He says, I don't approve the violence, but he says, look at this continuing discrimination. in public places and employment. Look at all this poverty in the Black community, especially among young people. All of this comes from somewhere. All of this comes from the history of discrimination. And a lot of the sentiment is going to be endorsed by a government report that comes out in 1968. It's called the Kerner Report. It had, LBJ had actually commissioned a special agency to determine why there was so much disorder, so much civil unrest in the 60s. Why is this happening? We need to explain this. And the report concludes, hey, guess what? It's not because of the Black Power movement. It's not because people are inferior. It is because of history and continuing systemic structural racism, continuing discrimination, especially in employment. What do you expect is going to happen when people don't have jobs and they're shoved into a ghetto? And so most of the participants in these riots, rebellions, whatever you want to call them, most of them are Northerners, most of them are young men, young Black men, and most of them are unemployed. Should we not expect high crime from a community that is isolated socially, isolated politically, isolated economically? Socially, it's like, hey, we don't want you near us. Politically, it's like, oh, we're going to keep you from voting. And isolated economically means we're not going to give you a decent job to raise your family. So what are people going to do day to day if they're not given the chance to do to succeed in the same way others are? Now, most white folk aren't going to hear any of this, especially at this time. Ordinary white folk, they blame Black people themselves. They blame the Black Power movement, and they look at how, you know, Black people were talking about kill Whitey, and they were. They're going to fume at the 1960 Olympics when two athletes, a guy named Juan Carlos and Tommy Smith, by the way, two U.S. athletes who just won, I think it was a 400-meter dash. It was a race, whatever. They, in Mexico City Olympics in 1968, when they're having their medals put over their necks, they will raise the Black Power fist. Now, they have walked out barefooted in their socks because they wanted that to symbolize the poverty of people, especially Black people in the ghettos. And then shoot up the Black Power symbol. And because of that, they get stripped of their medals, they get sent home early. When they come home, they get death threat, and they can't get good jobs for a long time, or any job for a very long time. And what's interesting is they had been told, don't do this, because word had got that they were going to plan this presentation, in a sense, this symbolic gesture. And they did it anyway. Recently, now I meant to check this, but there was an Olympian the other day, a Black woman who, I think she did like an X symbol with her arms or something. Oh, I forgot to look it up. I'm sorry, I'm behind in lots of stuff, but you're getting the meat of everything here, guys. But we saw this the other day, and the thing about it is that the Olympics are supposed to be apolitical, meaning they're supposed to be without politics. Now we all know that's not true, but these athletes are expected to not make a symbolic gesture, much like Colin Kaepernick was not expected to and was vilified for kneeling during the national anthem. It's interesting if you come to think about it, the national anthem, given what we know about the national anthem from the War of 1812. Remember Francis Scott Key, talking about, this is a great day and how slaves, are never going to rise and so forth. But anyway, what's interesting is that, I never really associated the national anthem with military. I've always thought about it more as ideas of equality, but somehow it's being equated now. If you for the national anthem, then you are, disrespecting the troops for some reason, and it's not something I quite understand, but you can feel that way if you like. What's interesting is that when the national band when the band plays the national anthem at NFL games, or when those planes fly over, that the NFL gets paid for that. They don't do that for free. This is advertising for the U.S. military, and it's fine, but it's all about advertising, and so we have to be careful calling it what it isn't. If the NFL really cared about the national anthem and about all this patriotic symbolism, then they wouldn't get paid to allow it. They would just allow it. In fact, this really didn't start until like 2000, after 9/11, when they really made a big thing about the national anthem being tied to the military. But anyway, I digress. So I don't know if anything's going to happen to this young woman Olympian. We'll see. So anyway, a lot of ordinary white folk, they're looking at this in this Black Power movement, and they don't understand this kill whitey stuff. They don't like the fist in the air. They don't understand the use of violence for political ends. But I think that's because they don't know history. White folk have been rioting like that in this country since at least the 1700s. I didn't cover any of this in this class, but all through the 1700s into the 1800s and early 1900s, you would see a lot of white people doing the same kinds of things when they weren't getting their way. For example, when they felt that they were being impoverished by corporations and that they had no job rights. So ordinary white folk are basically blaming the Black Power movement, but they're also blaming Black people themselves. They start to think, that you are inherently, by your nature, you are backwards. But of course, they can't really understand the historical forces, the context. You can't really explain to them about the redlining and the discrimination that causes the creation of ghettos with bad schools and few good jobs and a loss of hope. They don't recognize the pain and suffering from the lynching that people experienced or the police brutality that they experienced. Instead, they point to Black violence, right? And they say police are justified in cracking down and cracking heads. They should do it frequently and severely. So they use the Black violence instead of recognizing that it comes from somewhere. Just like the American Revolution, which is a violent affair, came from somewhere. Instead of recognizing that, they blame the people themselves. And they say, we want more police crack, more discrimination, because I don't want people around me who are like you. In fact, they seem to not really believe the Kerner report. Instead, they believe the Moynihan report that had come out just a few years before. Kerner report, we know, comes out in 68. Moynihan report, 65. Moynihan report was written by a guy who's the Assistant Secretary of Labor in 1965. And in this report, he blames the Black family for all the problems. He says the Black family is backwards. He says it does not prepare young people to be good citizens. But of course, he completely misses, well, everything of importance that we've talked about. History. The federal government, of course, is going to side with law and order. Right? They're gonna not worry about a more nuanced sort of understanding approach. They're gonna seek to stamp out the unrest, the violence, the Black militancy itself. And I get that, right? When things are happening, you need to shut things down, but you also have to take a look at what caused it. The federal government had for a long time sought to undermine the Black rights movement. For a long time, the federal government had surveilled a variety of groups. Ever since the 1950s, you had this organization. It's a government agency called COIN, and it is an agency and really a sort of project or mission called COINTELPRO, where they actually surveilled MLK Jr., Malcolm X, and other groups, and really also women's groups and other kinds of groups, Mexican Americans, all these groups of the 60s. And they regularly use illegal tactics. They would break the Fourth Amendment left and center with illegal wiretaps, breaking into people's businesses or homes without a warrant, opening mail without a warrant. Now, none of this was really publicly known at the time, but they were doing it. They were surveilling, of course, and even infiltrating the Black Panthers. They would send undercover agents black men into the Black Panthers to rile them up, to make them more angry, to make them more violent. The goal, of course, was to turn the public against them, and of course, to allow for arrests and a general crackdown. So they would send them in to rile them up. Now, all of this is happening. Cities are on fire. We know that the Vietnam is always burning in the background, and the violence is not over yet by 1968. In 1968, we know that MLK Jr. is in Memphis, Tennessee, and he's there to support a black union of sanitation workers, garbage men, really. So these men wanted the city to actually work with their union. They had a union. The city will not recognize it. The city doesn't want to work with them. And so MLK is there to support them. Remember, MLK by this time is really turning to the economic problems of the black community. He's staying at a place called the Lorraine Motel. He's outside standing on a balcony one day. All of a sudden, shot rings out. He falls to the ground. He's killed by a white man named James Earl Ray. Now, the news of this murder, of course, spreads very quickly. The father of the black nonviolent movement has been shot down in cold blood. There's no better message to these young people than this: his way does not work. This sends the message that his way, the nonviolent way, does not work. It sends the message that black lives do not matter. Young people, young black folk are going to hit the streets in full force. Soon, in moments, hundreds of cities across the nation are on fire. It's likely the largest violent civil disturbance in the country since the Civil War. City mayors across the country, they issue curfews. They give harsh orders to police. They say, shoot looters. You're not really supposed to shoot looters. In most states, you can't shoot people for stealing. In some states, you can. But they give orders to shoot looters. And arsonists, people who are going to set stuff on fire because they had Molotov cocktails and all this stuff, shoot to kill. So these are some harsh orders. LBJ has to call out the National Guard in the various states, and then eventually the U.S. Army. At the end, of course, we know the Army comes in, shuts it all down. There's tremendous damage, millions of dollars in damage, many more people killed, again, mostly black, and many more than that injured. Interestingly, the federal government, in the wake of this, will attempt to get at the root of the problem. They don't want to see this continuing to happen. We've had the Kerner report tell us what the problem is. So Congress passes, and of course, it is signed, the Civil Rights Act of '68. It's an anti-riot act and a Fair Housing Act. It's got other stuff in it too, like a Native American Civil Rights Act and everything else, but we're talking here about this, right? So it's got an anti-riot act where it says, look, it's going to be illegal to travel interstate if you have the intent, right? If you travel with the intent to have anything to do with the riot, you are, as soon as you cross that line, so long as you have that intent, as soon as you cross that state line, you have the intent to get involved in a riot for whatever reason, you had just committed a crime. Now, of course, it's going to be interpreted against you. What if you're just somebody who wanted to go to a peaceful protest, and all of a sudden a riot breaks out? What if you came from the next state over? They're going to say, it's going to be interpreted against you. They're going to accuse you of having the intent to riot when you cross state lines, even if you never had that intent. So a lot of people are going to get rounded up this way. So there's a whole stick approach here, right? They're going to try to beat you down. But there's also sort of a carrot approach. The Fair Housing Act. It's to get at discrimination in housing, as it sounds, right? Remember, there's discrimination in renting and selling, and banks, of course, aren't really going to, a lot of banks aren't going to want to lend to you. So and the financing as well. So renting, selling, and financing, meaning the lending of money for this. Now, interestingly, this Fair Housing Act is, it's targeting the black community, but it really protects the same people as are protected by the '64 Civil Rights Act, right? People of different religions, national origin, color, sex, all of that. This is really an attempt to de-ghettoize the cities. It doesn't really work because there's still all of that in place today. We'll talk about that shortly. By the early 1970s, racial violence is sort of dying down. Lynchings almost really don't happen anymore. Of course, black people are fighting back, so that's not going to be easy to do to them. Of course, also social values have been altered for the better. And a lot of people are still wondering, well, how much has changed since the 70s? By the 70s, excuse me. Black people were wondering this, right? Since Brown, people looking around the 70s, it's been 20 years since Brown. Schools are still largely segregated. What's interesting is that even today, in this year, as you're listening to this, right, black and brown students are generally still just as segregated as they were in the 50s. It doesn't seem that way for a lot of people, but in terms of national numbers, that's the way it is. Black and brown students generally are going to be going to the worst schools. They have well-meaning teachers who have their hands tied in many different ways. They're going to very often be dealing with older materials, like older buildings. You're going to have unruly students, that's for sure, because of, again, all of this stuff was just the other day. All these riots and things and all these problems are just the other day in the 60s. None of that is going to change that quickly. A lot of these students, even today, lack a culture of education. Why do they lack a culture of education? Because a culture of education must be given to you. If your parents don't have a culture of education, it's likely you won't either. People who have a college degree, or people whose parents have a college degree, are way better off than someone whose parents had only a high school degree. My son, and I have my degrees. My wife, of course, has a college degree. She was a teacher in 6th grade. Our son, he's fine because he has that culture. We're always behind him. Read, do this. What are you doing, right? We let him handle his own business because we don't want to actually run his life for him, but we continually guide him to the right path. Education's important. He reads a lot. But not everybody has that. In fact, a lot of students who come into school, even today, by the time they come into kindergarten, are already far behind if they are from poor areas. A lot of black and brown kids come in this way. They are part of a family that had very little education, and therefore are going to be behind. In fact, in not just the idea of schooling, but the tools that they have. The vocabulary of young black and brown kids in this country, by the time they hit kindergarten, is a lot lower, generally speaking, than that of white kids. So it takes a long time to turn around the weight of the past. The culture of education is inherited, just like wealth is inherited, just like a house is inherited. And so all of this is still weighing heavily on us today. And I'll tell you, there's still a culture of low expectations that a lot of people deal with. Because of the reality that a lot of black and brown have gone through in terms of being kept from a solid education, that has helped perpetuate the idea that if you are black or brown, then you perhaps are not as ready for education. Now, just so you know, and this may be controversial, but it's true, and that is that generally speaking, because of the history, black and brown children, as a general rule, come out of school less prepared generally than white students. But that's not because of inherent deficiencies. They're not deficient as people, but their education and their backgrounds are lacking something that we expect by the time they get to college. That's not the case for all of them, for sure. It wasn't the case for me. My mom went to 1st grade. My dad went to 4th. My mom went to 1st grade because she lived in Mexico at the time, and she had to go work in the fields at age 9. My dad left in 4th grade because he didn't have shoes to go to school in, and not only was that difficult, but it was embarrassing for him, and so he went to work. Now, my parents became very, very bright. They learned how to read. My dad has passed now, but he was really good at math. My mom, she writes church songs and poems and so forth, all in Spanish, of course, but bright, bright people. And, my parents didn't really have a whole lot to give. My mom always said, look, we're poor. All I'm gonna leave you is, my words, right? All I'm gonna leave you is my counsel. And so I'd always remember that. And that's what got me through all the degrees that I've gotten through. My mom used to work, and my dad used to work at a place called Gray Wire Specialty Company. It was in Cleveland, Ohio. The building's still there. Gray Wire Specialty. And it was, she used to work as a welder, my mom. And it was not skilled work. It was like a machine welding. And I went in there once or twice as a boy, and I'd see sparks flying everywhere, right? And my mom see her on the machine and stuff, and she would come home because a lot of time the metal would jump and hit her arms, and she'd have these burn marks on her arms, and she'd show me her arms. She'd extend her arms toward me and said, "Look, mijo, yo no quiero esto para ti," which just means, son, I don't want this for you. That's what got me through where I am. I wasn't special. I grew up, when I was growing up, I liked to hang out in the corner. That was much more fun than my school and opening my books. I was lucky because actually, I'm the seventh of 9 children, and my older siblings didn't have the same upbringing that I did, because I got the benefit of their experience. I'll give you an example, and it also ties in this idea of low expectations of students. When I was entering 9th grade, I was going to a new school, and I had to end up taking a Spanish test because I made the mistake of putting on the application that Spanish is spoken in the home. Once you do that, they're going to make you take an English test. Of course, my English was much better than my Spanish then. It still is, even though my Spanish has gotten a lot better. It still is. And so it's funny because I didn't really think about that until, a few years ago when my son was going into a new school. They asked that question, is any other languages spoken in the house? And I wanted to put, Spanish. My wife's like, no, don't do that, because they're going to make him take an English test. He'll pass it, but it's just another thing to do, right? And I was like, oh yeah, I didn't think about that. And I told her about the story. So I had to go take a test in English. And, my dad worked at a factory. He didn't have paid days off or anything like that. And so he had to take the day off to take me to go get a test. I aced it. And by the way, my dad never drove a car. We always took the bus everywhere. Or he used to walk to work and back, about a mile, in the cold winter of Cleveland winters. Anyway, so I took this test, took 2 buses, wasted a whole day, and, dad lost money. And then, of course, I aced it. And then, because I had to go through this process, I enrolled several days late, maybe about a week late in the school. When I get there, the lady at the front desk says, well, you can't choose your classes now because, school's already started. I'm going to send you to Mr. Lakis. Mr. Lakis was the vice principal, and he was mean, right? And I don't know how it is up there with you guys, but vice principals, of course, have this reputation of being like the enforcers, right? Kind of. And I had already heard of Mr. Lakis because my brothers had gone to that school. So I go there, and I tell him, she told me to come here and have you fill out my schedule. And he said, okay. He took one look at me, didn't really ask me to sit down. Took one look at me. He wrote out my schedule. He hands it to me, and I still remember. I said, oh, can I go home now? No, you're going to class. Right? Okay, fine. So I go to class. I had a good day that day, fun day. I go home and I show my mom my schedule, and she says, qué bueno, mijo, dale gas. Really, it just means, oh, this is great, son. Do your best, right? And then I show my schedule to my brother, and he's like, what the F is this, right? So he actually says the word, right? So I'm like, what's going on? And what he explains to me, and I didn't really know anything, Mr. Lakis had taken one look at me and given me a class schedule that was not geared toward college. It was geared the other way. He had given me industrial arts, woodworking. He had given me the most basic math, the kind of math where the math book just says mathematics or something like that. Earth science or some kind of general science something, right? And my brother had already been teaching me algebra, so I already knew some of that. And so he's like, no, you go back there. He wrote out a new schedule. He says, you go back there and you tell him to give you these classes. And he wrote down biology, and he wrote down English, lit, whatever, all college prep classes. And he says, you go back there and you give that to him, and you do not leave until he gives you the new schedule. And I was like, what the hell? Who am I to tell Mr. Lakis anything, right? So I went in there scared. And I was always really short, right, little. And Mr. Lakis was like, I don't know, 20 feet tall or something. So I walk in and I blurted out, I said, look, Mr. Lakis, my brother says, give me the schedule, and I can't leave until you give it to me. And I was so nervous, I just kind of threw the paper at him. And he just looked at me like, who's this fool? And so I sat down like right away. And he looks at it and he starts talking to me. He takes about 20 minutes talking to me. Then he realizes, oh yeah, maybe his kid can do it. He changes my schedule. He puts me in all college prep classes. But this kind of thing happened all the time. There are people my age who had this happen to them. And I have students even today who tell me this has happened to them, or something similar has happened to them, where they're kind of, pushed into a certain sort of, again, that day, my first day of school, I was having fun. I was in woodworking, making like a birdhouse. I was like, clack, clack, clack. I was having all kinds of fun. I would rather do that than algebra, because left to my own devices, school is hard. I would have been fine with it if it hadn't been for my older brother, who had already sort of been through the system, right? And who said, no, this has to change. If Mr. Lakis had had his way, I don't know that I would be speaking with you today. Point is, even today, there's this long sort of, the weight of the past is still with us. And so even today, we have problems with school segregation, not just physically, but in fact, in terms of expectations and in terms of the kind of education that students get. Education is still a problem. By the 1970s, let's get back to this. So by the 1970s, housing discrimination is very entrenched. It's going to take time to de-ghettoize that. And by the way, it's still that way largely. Cleveland is still very, very racially segregated, for example. Also by the 1970s, the good jobs are still kept from black folk, even good city jobs. Poverty is entrenched. Despite LBJ's, should I flip this? I don't even know. Oh no, that's pictures. LBJ had this war on poverty, right? And he actually, where is that? I had another, where is that slide? Hang on. Come on. Where did I do that slide? Could have sworn. Hang on, guys, bear with me. All right, maybe I didn't. Okay, so LBJ had a war on poverty by the mid-60s. He had actually passed what's called the Equal Opportunity Act. Equal Opportunity Act, 1964. Under this Equal Opportunity Act, he had established several things. One was called Job Corps, C-O-R-P-S, Job Corps, C-O-R-P-S. And what it was supposed to do was, in fact, create employment for the poor. And of course, employment for all poor people. There's a lot of poor white people this time, for sure. But of course, targeting inequality, racial inequality. So Job Corps is part of this Equal Opportunity Act. And all of this is part of his war on poverty. He also establishes something called Head Start, which you may or may not have heard of. Generally people who are at the lower rungs economically of society are the ones that are going to send their kids to this. You have to in fact, qualify by being poor. It's early education for poor kids, age 4. The idea is to get kids started early, Head Start, right? To get the kids started early and to get the parents started early in understanding the importance of education. The Head Start program is not very well funded. A lot of people push back on it. A lot of middle class people will push back because they'll say, well, I might want my kid to have Head Start too. Why should my tax dollars go to that kid and my kid can't go to Head Start? I want him to start school at 4. Point is, still lots of problems with that. He also starts a thing called VISTA, V-I-S-T-A, which really stands for Volunteer Service of America, right? how you get Vista, I don't know, but that's what they call it. So the Volunteer Services of America, VISTA, whatever. And here, it's like if you've ever heard of the Peace Corps, if you know anybody, go to the Peace Corps. Young people, usually young, not always, college degree people go around the world and they serve in communities around the world. Well, that was JFK's thing because he was a Cold Warrior. There's a whole thing behind that. He wanted to establish ties with countries that might go communist. But anyway, whatever. LBJ wants to help people here. Volunteers helping out poor people in poor communities, white, black, and brown. But point is, the poverty is still entrenched by the 1970s. This does not seem to be working. And today, there's still higher rates of poverty among people of color. Now, in raw numbers, there are the average. If you put all the black people, all the poor black people, all the poor brown people, and all the poor white people like in groups, but next to each other, you're gonna have more poor white folk than you're gonna have of the other two groups. But that's because of raw numbers, because white people are still the majority in the country. But in terms of rates of poverty, it's higher among people of color. And all of this is tied to educational problems, right? Historical problems based in education, based in discrimination in jobs, and so forth. And so by the 70s, people are wondering, what's really changed, right? And racism is still endemic, meaning it's built into society, it's pervasive, and it's hateful. I knew I had that slide. Goodness. It disappeared. In 1967, the Supreme Court actually decided a case called Loving v. Virginia. Loving, like loving someone, v. Virginia. 1967. In Loving v. Virginia, the court finally in 1967 actually strikes down state laws that prohibit interracial marriage. It was largely symbolic for a very long time, though. Interracial marriage, in fact, was very low for a very long time, and only in the last 10, 15 years has it really taken off. We'll maybe look at a graph of that. Point is, this Supreme Court case, Loving v. Virginia, it was where a white man was married to a black woman in Virginia, and they were vilified. They were told to leave. They were put in jail for being married, if you can believe that. For a long time, though, and they win, right? Goes to court, but it's highly symbolic, and only symbolic for a very long time. Now today, we know that things have changed a lot. But when I was growing up, people still attacked interracial couples. It happened in the 80s and even today, people still don't like it. But of course, interestingly, today you see on television a lot of commercials, almost all of them have interracial families on them, which is interesting because it really overstates the reality. A lot of, the percentage of interracial marriages are nowhere near what you think what you would think would be the case if all you did was watch TV. And so my point is simply this: we're still largely divided, right? We know that there's a lot of hatefulness. People still don't want to be around each other a lot of the time. Although that has changed dramatically. Don't get me wrong. I'm sure yourself or other people don't feel that way, but a lot of people still do. And you have to remember that a lot of people live in other areas of the country other than big cities, for example. And today, there's a rise in hate crimes, right? There's been a rise in hate crimes and a rise in the number of white supremacist groups. It spiked in 2008. Why? Barack Obama, president. And it spiked again in 2015. Why? Trump, president. Now, you can think whatever you like about Trump, and you can say, well, he's not a racist, whatever. But here's the thing. White supremacist groups believed he was a racist. They believed that he, in fact, would push their agenda. And to a large extent, it's arguably he did. Giving them, in that one debate, he says, to the Proud Boys, stand back and stand by. right? Because he was asked, can you denounce these violent thugs who actually support you? And he's like, he tells the Proud Boys, stand back and stand by. Stand by means, wait for your orders. So, whatever you think about him, there's a reality here. I don't think history is going to be very kind to him. So today we have, a lot of hate crimes, and so not a whole lot has changed, I suppose. Although that's not really true, but for the individual who suffers something like this, it hasn't changed. Let me put it that way. By and large, we are a better nation than we were, I think. So, but please, by the 1970s, people are wondering, were the 60s a success? What will they give birth to? Are things going to get better? Are going to get worse? People start saying, not much has changed. More needs to be done. I'm going to hang on, guys, because I know I had a slide for this. And I don't know what happened to it. I might have actually opened up the wrong PowerPoint presentation. Oh, I know what happened. There it is. Yep. I knew it. I'm going to try to switch. I'm really bad at this. We'll see if this works. But I'm going to try to share my screen instead of what I'm doing now. Because I found that slide. Bear with me, guys, please. Okay, how do I? Okay. Bear with me, bear with me, bear with me. It's always fun. Ha, there it is. See, War on Poverty, Equal Opportunities Act, Job Corps. Okay, now I'm having trouble getting back to where I was. Anyway, take down these notes real quick. I'll give you just a couple minutes because I'm going to move on to talking about other stuff, and I need to look at other stuff on my computer while I do that. You can, of course, take a moment to pause this, write it down, and then restart it. So I will assume you're going to do that. So I will stop sharing here. What I'm going to talk about shortly will deal with affirmative action. Okay, let's get back to the PowerPoint presentation. Oh, bear with me, guys. I told you it was going to be a rough one today. Okay, I'll just leave it right there for now. I think am I sharing? Yes, I'm sharing. Okay, so a lot of people are looking at whether or not the government the country is debating the propriety of affirmative action, whether or not it's proper. Affirmative action is interesting because a lot of people don't understand, and a lot of people don't understand it. Affirmative action is really what the government should do to take purposeful, affirmative, purposeful, active efforts to promote integration, to promote the success of people of color, Black success here with regard to education, housing, employment, these kinds of things. When it comes to integration, by the way, just real quick, one of the things that people start to do, and so that cities start to do, is to actually do busing, where they will try to integrate cities by busing kids across town. Even if your school is across the street, you might have to be bused across the town because you're a white kid or because you're a Black kid, and they're trying to mix you up. That became a problem for a lot of people. Another reason for white flight, by the way. But let's talk about affirmative action with regard to things like education and employment. Affirmative action is going to be pushed largely by LBJ at first. Executive orders, really. Congress isn't really going to do much with this. I'll just give you an example. In 1965, LBJ actually signs an executive order that requires all private businesses that have federal contracts, right? You have to have a federal contract. If you're a business that has a federal contract, then you have to take initiatives to hire people of color, Black people, of course. So all private businesses dealing with the federal government through a contract have to take positive steps to hire people who've been largely kept out of the workforce, people of color. In 1967, by the way, that's expanded to white women. And interestingly enough, and I'm just kind of go off on a tangent here, white women will ultimately benefit the most from affirmative action. Government efforts to actually integrate or to improve the lot of people, right? The lots of people of color, and then women. But white women are going to benefit the most. So it really starts with LBJ. But even Richard Nixon, who is, of course, a darling of a lot of the conservative movement, is in the first couple of years of his presidency, he sets out goals and timetables for hiring people of color and women. He tells, just like LBJ, he signs executive orders to say, we need some goals and timetables for hiring. Now, he doesn't want quotas. He says no quotas. He says, if you have 100 people, it's not that you have to hire 13 Black people. He doesn't say it's like that, but you cannot, because you can't really write into law. But you have to take positive steps. What do we mean by this? Well, businesses are really going to be encouraged to do things like advertise in Black neighborhoods, and we'll do things like train Black people who maybe, if they are given the training, can actually do the job that's needed. So provide training for people. It doesn't mean you hire people just because they're one race or another. It's not supposed to be that. It was never supposed to be that, just so you know. But a lot of people don't get that, and that's okay. We'll come back to that issue. Now, a lot of businesses are going to push back. They're not going to want this. So what did they start to do? A lot of them will start requiring IQ tests or high school diplomas for jobs, even though they didn't before. They start requiring IQ tests or high school diplomas for jobs that have nothing to do with a high school diploma or an IQ test. So, I mean, if you are going to be shoveling manure, why do you need a high school diploma for that? If you're going to be shoveling manure, why do you need a high school diploma? Why do you need an IQ test for that? What they were doing was taking advantage of the lack of education among people of color, Black people in particular. The lack of education, of course, is there because of discrimination throughout history. And so by requiring a high school diploma, you're already going to lock out a lot of them. And of course, today you can't really get a decent job with a high school diploma, or most kinds of jobs, even jobs that don't require them. Or really, I mean, do you really need a high school diploma to be a baggage handler? Maybe, or to be a grocery store clerk. I mean, not really. but some places will still require that, right? Funny enough, I actually I got my GED when I was in my 20s. I already had a grocery store job for a long time. I had started when I was in high school, so they just kind of kept me on. I guess they assumed I graduated. They were wrong. I went to really bad school and I just wasn't challenged. I ended up dropping out. That's really my fault, but that's a whole longer story. But anyway, so the thing is, requiring a high school diploma really tended to impact certain groups of people, right? The uneducated, of course, are targeting Black people. All IQ tests that are given, they're really geared toward white middle class culture. Do Black people in the ghetto know anything about symphonies or know anything about, the types of things that middle class white folk know? Just as a matter of course, typically not. So they were really doing this purposefully, IQ tests and high school diploma requirements. Now, this is going to be ruled unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. In a Supreme Court case called Griggs v. Duke Power, the NAACP had filed a lawsuit on behalf of Black janitors because these Black janitors had been required to take an IQ test or provide a high school diploma. And in a unanimous decision, the Supreme Court says you cannot require, for a janitor position, you don't need this. And so the idea is that even a policy that seems neutral, if its purpose is to, because that's what its purpose was, if its purpose is to discriminate, okay, and that's important. If you meant to do this, and of course you have to prove that. So you can still require today high school diplomas and stuff like that, but if you do it for the purpose of discriminating against groups of people, you can't do that. Point is, the unanimous decision says job requirements must have a business necessity. If you're going to require a diploma, then there's got to be a reason for it. It cannot be that you want to keep people out, and that's what these people were doing. So these requirements are unnecessary at the Griggs, at the Duke Power Company. In fact, how do we know this? Because the court looked back and said, well, all these white workers who were hired long before this rule, they do the job just fine. You're not asking them. They're being grandfathered in, right? You're not asking them for a high school diploma because you already know they can do the job. What you're trying to do is keep these other people out. Now, a lot of private companies misinterpret the decision. They believe that they must meet a quota. They hire people of color and women to fill quotas. This is a misinterpretation, a misunderstanding of what the presidents had signed into law. It's a misunderstanding of what the Supreme Court had said. And because of this, it gives the whole affirmative action system a bad name because they're starting to hire just because of who they are, not who they are and what they can do. Again, affirmative action isn't supposed to be about quotas. It's supposed to be about doing things like advertising jobs in Black communities, which they never used to do. If you don't advertise in the Black community, you're not going to get people. It's supposed to be about providing training programs directed at the lower levels, not just hiring them outright, but trying to bring them up. It's really about helping those people who can do the job, helping them get prepared to do the job. Now, by the mid-1970s, actually, a lot of affirmative action does result in the increase of better jobs for Black people and women, people of color generally, and women. But a lot of that is because it was misinterpreted. Now, in 1978, the Supreme Court is going to, in fact, make it clear that this is not what they meant. In the case of Bakke v. University of California at Davis, 1978, a white medical student, or a white student who wanted to apply to the University of California Davis Law School, medical school, he is denied admission. And he realizes that certain Black students, he finds out somehow, certain Black students, I think somebody on the inside tipped him off, certain Black students who did not score as high as he did on his test to get into medical school, that they were actually allowed in. And not only that, and that's not so much the problem because some of that is still allowed, but what the problem was that the school was using quotas. It said, okay, we have 100 students, just for example, 100 students coming in, 13 of them have to be black or whatever, right? And what the Supreme Court says is that quotas are unconstitutional. They've been unconstitutional since 1978. In fact, they were never legal. It was never intended that way. But I bet you, maybe somebody you know, or maybe yourself, always assumed it was supposed to be about quotas. Now, part of that could be because of the history of it, as I have explained it, but also because of something else that the court says in Bakke. And that is this, that it is okay for schools, colleges, to consider race as one of various factors in determining admissions. So it's allowing race to be used as one of many factors, but race cannot be determinative. Now, the problem with this is that that's not very exact. So how do you know, right? And so, but on the other hand, it gives a school flexibility to actually bring in different people. Now, after the Bakke decision, a lot of black people started being kept out of law schools and medical schools because they were benefiting from the misinterpretation from the past. But now that people are like, okay, we're finally getting it right in the terms of the law, maybe not the right thing to do, but the right thing in the term of the law. What happens is that the number of black students and brown students enrolled in colleges and universities and medical schools and law schools, that drops dramatically. Now, this issue has been relitigated. There's a case before the Supreme Court now dealing with the University of Texas, also dealing with Harvard. And by the way, when it comes to school admissions, affirmative action only affects the top tier schools. It's not going to affect a community college. Everybody's welcome. It's not going to affect really most state schools, right? Everybody, there's a certain something that you have to do to get in for sure, but they're not. We're talking about the most selective schools that are really the issue here. Now, again, even today though, admissions considering race are still okay. A lot of the job requirements though, with regard to what the federal was doing and requiring, affirmative action in hiring of black men and women, if you have a federal contract, a lot of that has been changed as well. Here's my point. We don't need to go into that, but here's my point. Affirmative action has largely been rolled back by the Supreme Court in the last 20, 25 years. Ever since Bakke, really. Today, affirmative action has all been but reversed. Jobs and education still being fought in the courts. Now, by the late 1970s, the second Reconstruction, which is what a lot of people call the civil rights movement for black people in the 1960s, the second Reconstruction seems about over. Like the first Reconstruction, right? Like Reconstruction itself, when people look at the second Reconstruction, a lot of people will believe that what could be done has been done. It's like, we've done enough. And so really the second Reconstruction, much like the first, promises a lot, but doesn't always deliver. And there's going to be a huge backlash to the 60s. Into the 1970s and in the 80s, there's going to be a huge backlash. You're going to see a huge conservative backlash among Southerners in particular, and rural folk, a lot of Midwestern folk, a lot of ordinary white folk, and of course religious folk. They're going to push back against all the changes of the 1960s. Right? They're under Nixon. They're going to talk about taking their country back. They're going to talk about how the nation was lost, how during the 60s, all of these good Christian, white, certain kinds of people, right? They stood by while the nation was taken away from them by the young, by women, by people of color, by gay people, with their tax money because of this war on poverty, because their tax money is coming out of their pockets to pay for people who do not look like them. But of course, they're talking about welfare, right? But of course, a lot of people on welfare are white. Most people on welfare in raw numbers today are white. I mean, if you look at rural areas, if you look at West Virginia and places like that, there's a lot of white poverty. Point is, next time we're going to talk about this backlash. Now, I do want to show you some pictures, right? So this, of course, is an example of the Black Power movement gaining force. Oh, this, of course, is Glorious Gloria, the local leader of the, as it says there, the Cambridge movement. These are RAM, again, the guns. Of course, Malcolm X. The main nation of Islam, yeah, men and women. Of course, Malcolm X again, who in fact becomes more sort of moderate in his later years. Here's a picture of James Meredith. I told you he was shot in the back on his walk against, when he's talking about, pushing back against fear. The Stokely Carmichael, right? Black Power and all that. These are, of course, the people who engage in the whole cultural Africanism, African cultural stuff. In here you have, Kwanzaa being celebrated. Some people still celebrate Kwanzaa today. I think it was more popular in the decades following the 60s. Here you have the Black Panther Party, and notice it says Black Panther Party for Self-Defense. You have Bobby Seale there. And oh my goodness, you got brain freeze. And Huey P. Newton, and acting all militant and so forth. Here's a woman named Angela Davis. She was also, in fact, a Black Panther, and notice, of course, dealing with white people as well, and their whole push against the Vietnam War. Angela Davis would later on, of course, she's on the left there, she would become a professor later on. We're not, Black Panthers, these young people, these are students, they're not idiots. Here are the Black Panthers in Sacramento at the Capitol of California when they, I guess, stormed the Capitol, quote unquote. Now, people actually, after the storming of the Capitol on the 6th, a lot of people, in fact, said, oh, look, Black people did it too. They did it. They stormed the Capitol in Sacramento in 1967, whatever it was. And no, that's not true. So I heard a lot of people saying this, a lot of conservative folk saying that this was the case. And I said, look, no, this was legal. Doing this was absolutely legal at the time. Nobody busted in. A lot of people today would wish they could do this today at the U.S. Capitol building. In California at this time, it was fine. They were following the law. The people on January 6th, no. Here are the Black Panthers feeding people. Notice they invite everybody, right? They're not, they might talk about kill whitey, but they're talking really about the whitey establishment, the whitey way of thinking. And of course, personal self-defense if it comes down to that, but they're not hateful. They're serving lunches to people of all kinds. Here's the Huff Riot. This is on 79th Street, which is just down the street from where I went to high school. Just maybe 2 blocks over from where I went to high school. The Orangeburg Massacre, and again, this was brutal stuff. Bowling alley. Watts riots. Excuse me. And I can't get this pictures of. I can't really see it, but I think it was the Detroit riot. Could be wrong. Maybe New. I think it's Newark actually. You could probably see it on there. I can't really see it. That's a Detroit riot. So the other one was a Newark riot, I suppose. This, of course, is where they raise their power salute. Here's MLK Jr. If you see him there, laying there at their feet, crumpled, and the guy is, of course, pointing to where they think the shot came from. It's a very famous picture. This shows that even today, there's a lot of segregation in schools, in K through 12 schools. This shows us that even today, there's there is a lot of segregation in terms of housing. The red areas, this is Cleveland where I grew up, by the way. This is Cleveland right there. I grew up like right around here, right on the edge. This area, the red area, I'm pointing as though you can actually see. Maybe you can't see. Oh, hang on, maybe I can use this. So right here, right, that's Cleveland. And I grew up right around here somewhere. Right about there, maybe no, right about there, I think. Anyway, this whole red area is black, so it's deeply segregated. A lot of cities in the north are like this for the reasons that I've already talked about. So we also talked about poverty by race. Non-Hispanic white poverty levels are much lower. They've kind of remained steady. Of course, poverty levels among black people and brown people have gone down a little bit over the years, but and Asian people are almost right to where white people are who are non-Latino. But again, there are still great divides. This shows that there's still a big college gap, right, by race and gender. Of course, in terms of completion, white women are now, since the 90s, really outpacing even white men. White women are doing the best out of any group in terms of, if you look to the movement of the civil rights and who gained the most. I wish I had more time to sort of unpack that for those of you who maybe aren't so sure about that, but it's documented well. And so there's a lot of gaps here with regard to college completion. Even when people get college degrees, if you are black, or even if you get an education, right? So bachelor's degree or higher, you see here. Here you see the that's it, right? So white, black. So without a bachelor's degree, you see among black people, Hispanic people, Latino people, compared to white folk, right? In terms of how much money they make, right? And of course, I'm looking at it backwards, right? No bachelor's degree, that's the dark, excuse me. Bachelor's degree or higher is in the light blue, excuse me. So obviously people who don't have a bachelor's degree are going to be down here in the darker levels. But even there is a discrepancy, right, between black and white, between Latino white, and of course people with a bachelor's degree. So all of that, and in fact, I mean, there's a huge difference here, right? I think the difference between this and this down here is actually bigger than the difference between this and this. I could be wrong about that, who knows. But the point is, even getting a college degree, you're not going to get the same kind of job, just by and large. Now I'll leave you with this thought with regard to affirmative action. Next time we're going to talk about the white backlash, largely politically, Ronald Reagan and all that kind of stuff, if we can get to that. I have to see how long this video is because this has been a long sort of session. Okay, so Lyndon Johnson, in talking about affirmative action, says, "You do not take a person who, for years, has been hobbled by chains and liberate him, bring him up to the starting line of a race, and then say, 'You are free to compete with all the others,' and still justly believe that you have been completely fair. We seek not just legal equity, but human ability, not just equality as a right and a theory, but equality as a fact and equality as a result." What he's saying is that you cannot now claim to be race blindness. You can't claim race blindness and say, well, you can't really treat these, even though you've treated these people so bad for so long, now you have to treat them equally. Well, that doesn't help because of all the wrong that's been done. If you want equity, then you bring them up, and you have to take affirmative action to do that. That's his point. Okay, that's his point. Okay, I hope this recorded because I don't know how to work this thing very well, and I know it's a little bit choppy, but here we go. Okay, people, thank you for listening. Be well, be good, and take care. Next time.